Good afternoon, everyone. So I see there's some people, you can't, from the back of the room you can't see, but we do have a couple of empty seats towards the front. So if you're at the back and you plan to stay for the whole session and don't want to be on your feet, filter forwards. I'm giving you 10 seconds to come forward and find a place to sit. Everyone, thank you very much. Some of you I've been seeing here since 10 o'clock this morning. Some people I know have come just for this event. It's great to have you all here. I am going to get out of the way very quickly so we can get straight into this event that is clearly one of the most popular ones at the festival. I like to do something at the start of every event to send a signal to everyone nearby that we're about to begin, which is to ask you to clap as loudly as you can. Well, I didn't ask for the whistles, but that's a nice add-on. But I think now nobody's in any doubt that the session is about to start. I'm going to hand you over now to Teresa White, who is the host and moderator for this session. We are delighted to have these two writers here with us, Soraya Palmer and Ingrid Persaud. And I would just like to say, Ingrid's book, it's almost hot off the press. It's at least still warm off the press. It was launched in London just a couple of days ago, and don't correct me if I'm wrong, Ingrid, but this is only the second event she's done in the world with this new book. So we're delighted to have her here at the festival. It's always nice to have a book that's like brand new at the festival. Delighted to have her here with Soraya Palmer, who I only discovered yesterday in conversation, has Trini roots, so she's an honorary Trini as far as we're concerned this afternoon. I'm going to get out of the way now, have a wonderful conversation, and I'm going to hand over to Teresa. Please give them another round of applause to welcome them. Let's start.
Thanks very much for that, Nicholas. So before we get into the readings, I'm just going to give you a little brief intro. So Ingrid, we've heard that your Lost Love Songs of Boysie Singh, hot off the press, and it's brilliant, by the way. I can't recommend it highly enough. And Ingrid is Trini born, but she's been living in the UK and Barbados and back in the UK again. She's got some awards to her name. She got the first award for the Sweet Stop, that was your short story, the Commonwealth Short Story Prize, National Short Story Prize for the BBC in 2018. Love After Love won the Costa Award for first novel. You Write Widely, Granta, the UK Guardian, Prospect, Prix. But what's really quite interesting is that you were once a legal academic and an artist, and now a writer. That's quite eclectic and very cool. Soraya, Flatbush born, but Trini mum and Jamaican dad, so I think more than honorary West Indian, definitely one of ours. And licensed social work as well. And you've done a lot of work with the youth, and organising them, particularly people who suffer from gender-based violence and people facing imprisonment associated with GBV as well. Your book, The Human Origins of Beatrice Porter and Other Essential Ghosts, brilliant. Really enjoyed reading it. Not always an easy read because sometimes it hits a bit hard, but definitely worth the reading. Much anticipated in the US. It was called the buzziest debut novel by Goodreads. Today had it as the top 38 best new books in 23, and Ms. and Elle both had it as most anticipated for 2023. So we've got some pretty amazing women right here who are going to give us a little reading, and then we'll have some questions and a conversation and hopefully some audience participation. Over to you, Soraya.
Hey, everybody. Working. Okay. Oh, hi. This is my first reading in Trinidad. So it's exciting and a little bit nerve-wracking too. But it's really good to be here. I'm going to be reading from chapter 6, which is a chapter about the father, but going back into his childhood, the father Nigel, who loves to tell stories to his kids. And he especially loves to tell the story about him and his brother defeating the rolling calf. And this story kind of tells what really happened between him and his brother and his brother's lover, Harold, as well. And I'm reading from kind of the middle end of it when they see the rolling calf. The rolling calf is also called Old Man Toby. It was then that the boys thought they heard something, a chain rattling, cracking against tar road and tree trunk. It's true, it smelled of sausage, but not of any sausage you've ever eaten. You could smell the things they put inside it, the things you pretend aren't there when you devour it with stewed tomato or jerk sauce. You know which parts I'm referring to. I won't get into it. I'll just say that besides the smell of insides, it also smells revoltingly familiar. You are now aware that the calf was once human. You're aware he could be you. The smell of fire came, and then the sight of the beast. Blood rose from the rolling calf's nostrils like heat. Pus dripped from his mouth. The horns atop his head were gnarled and knobbed as tree trunks, much larger than the fake horns on Harold's head earlier. His eyes swirled like lava. His chain tail snapped the ground, and the earth separated into minerals. Nigel realized that the calf had probably come for the rest of his chain. Instinctively, Oscar moved closer to Harold and put his arms around him. How are they supposed to wind up victorious in their mission with this lanky batty boy in their way? And more importantly, why did it always seem to Nigel that he was never enough for his brother? Nigel watched their embrace in disgust for just a moment when he had a thought. Why not teach this batty boy a lesson once and for all? He slipped the chain link tail into Oscar's knapsack, knowing that all he would have to do once the calf began to chase him was to stab him in the leg with the penknife and then drag him into the sea. Oscar would be fine, of course, and hopefully all the wiser. And yet, with one swift movement, the calf charged into Harold and Oscar with his horns, and they toppled over. The boys began to run. The boys began to scream. Old Man Toby moved closer to Batty Boy number 1 and 2 to try and explain to them of their sins. Of course, no English words came out of his mouth, just fire and sounds whose only purpose must have been to put fear into man. The calf snarled at the boys, pointing his horns at them for effect, and then Battyman 1 and 2 fell to the ground and rolled around like girls. He heard his tail crack the grass. He charged the 2 boys with his horn, and they scattered. He followed the boys into the bush. The 3rd boy, who had taken the rest of his chain, disappeared in the bushes opposite the Battyman. That's Nigel. He'd deal with him later, of course. He decided to start with the redskin boy, and he pushed him down with his horn. His initial plan was only to preach to him, but there was a hunger growing inside him. He opened his lips to the boy's arm. The redskin boy began to cry. Just a taste, he said to himself. A taste won't kill him. A taste will only teach him a lesson. But ooh, tastes so good. Better than sweets, better than the touch of a woman. The blood filled him now. His body began to cool down, as if he were swimming in the ocean, like a wave breaking overhead, like the sun setting over his eyes, as though he were swimming in the middle of a rainbow. He could feel the boy's limbs breaking apart against his teeth, felt the bones crackle and pop inside his mouth, felt them swish around inside his belly. Was like Oscar had never heard the stories before. You never run from the rolling calf. But then Harold started running too. Watching his brother roll around on the ground screaming, he felt a growing horror inside him as he worried he might throw up. He ran toward the calf with his bag of sand and salt water in hand. When he caught up to where they had fallen, he cried out at the sight before him. It was Oscar lying on the ground, barely conscious and bleeding as the calf took a bite from his left arm. The calf looked up at Nigel to see his bag of sand. Steam evaporated off his hanging tongue. His breath smelled of smoke and rotten meat. The calf was quickly approaching him now. The steam and the smoke came together to make wind, and you remember what I told you about wind, right? Well, on this day, the wind herself wore a steel blue dress. She ran circles around the rolling calf's eyes and mouth, scaring the flies and mosquitoes away from landing there. Nigel thought of his father's warning, and yet the calf seemed scared too. His fiery breath wavered in the breeze as he shook from side to side. The calf tried to sink his hooves deeper into the earth for balance from the wind. Nigel thought that maybe his father was wrong, that maybe the wind was a sign of something like a miracle, or at the very least, a good diversion. Nigel used the opportunity to stick his penknife into the ground while Harold attempted to carry Oscar into the bushes to hide. And then came the rain. It started as a leaky pipe kind of drizzle, before coming down at a steady pace. Small puddles transformed into pools all around them. Nigel took out his whip and tried to herd the beast towards the ocean, only a few kilometers from where they stood. The calf looked afraid. His fire was dying. All that came out his mouth now was smoke. He began to cough. His horns began to shrink. The wind herself swirled around his face like a small tornado. Now Nigel used this opportunity to gloat, to consider that maybe fathers didn't actually know everything. Sometimes they existed only to make you feel less than. He took out his penknife and lunged at the calf like it was his sword. The knife grazed the calf's neck and blood spurted. He was whimpering now. Nigel laughed. "You see here?" He snared at the wind, but Nigel didn't notice the hot air become cold. The wind's shy laugh as she opened her arms to the sky, her blue dress flying upward, turning gray, turning black, how her dress was ripping up stones and wood planks off houses, how cheap folding chairs took flight. Nigel stood transfixed to the pieces of steel blue, creating moon shapes in the air. Didn't anybody ever tell him not to push against the wind? She's unpredictable. Hurricanes and tornadoes come out of nowhere, they say, and it's true. She'd never admit it to anyone, but underneath all that bravado, all she really wants is a little recognition, for the world to know that even the wind gets a little lonely sometimes. It's no wonder she feels the need to be everywhere at once. Meanwhile, Harold picked up Oscar, heading for the hills. The rolling calf came charging right after them, leaving Nigel to admire the lunge. The calf threw his horns at their torsos, and the boys began to scream. And then came the wind. The wind herself took the calf and the boys into her bosom and flew. She flew them up over the moon. She flew them up over their neighborhood and over their homes. They saw chickens in trees and duppies sleeping under children's beds through the windows. Harold held on tight to Oscar. He kissed Oscar's arm above where it had been bitten. Oscar leaned into Harold's chest. They took a deep breath and closed their eyes. This is the part we call the final act, in which our villain is vanquished. Unfortunately for you, however, his defeat will bring little joy. It was in fact old man Toby himself who prayed that Jesus would come for him that night. On this night, the calf saw huts flooded and sinking down into Babylon, saw himself fly over the ocean, saw the moon glow like heavenly light. The wind herself dropped him down into the sea, and he could feel himself burning. It made a hush sound like a hiss. He felt his horns break off into the water and watched them float along the current. He felt his fur wash off his skin, saw bits of fur float all around him. He felt himself melt into the ocean. It was at this point that he realized he could no longer feel his body. "God, please tell me the plan," he said before disappearing into the sea. The wind herself forced Harold and Oscar to drink from her teat. In their last moments, the two lovers drank in mango peel, baby powder, Milo tins filled with pennies, hair grease, butterfly wings, and nail clippings. And when there was nothing left to swallow, they were made to swallow wind. She got inside of them, in their lungs, in their bellies, until they were finished. Just two bodies tossed and found by the side of the road before church on a Sunday. Nigel watched his brother fly up over the trees with Oscar and the wind before disappearing into rain. Nigel waved his arms frantically, trying to call out Harold's name, but the wind took his words every time. All that came out was and the shushing sound of the wind in his ears. His body sank down into the earth until he felt warm again, until he thought, maybe this isn't really happening to me, or maybe she'll take me too. Yes, Gilda went hard that night. Mud swallowed houses. Goat and cow slipped and broke their necks. Puddles became lakes and rivers with tree branch, human limb, and uneaten fruit drifting around like dead fish. Houses became seashells and got swept away. Wind wasn't angry. Truth is, girl was just hungry. Swallowed 6 people whole and spit them back out as bones. Harold, Oscar, and old man Toby were only 3.
Hi. There are a few seats in between if you don't want to stand for the rest of the time. Good afternoon. What an honor to be here. Thank you to Bocas for inviting me. This is absolutely where my book should be launched. I'm a Trini and I've written a Trini book. So, 2 days after it's published, I have you, who I consider my first real audience. So thank you all for being here. So the Lost Love Songs of Boysie Singh is fiction, I should just say, at the start. And it is the story of Boysie Singh, who most of you would know about, a mass murderer, pirate, gambling king, womanizer, part-time preacher, and his life is the thread that runs through the book, but he's never given a voice. This is the story of 4 women in his life. Manalala, his baby mother, Popo, a sex worker who lived with him, Rosie, someone he knew from childhood and meets later in life, and Doris, the woman he married. And today I'm going to read you from the beginning of the book, and the first thing is what looks like entry from a newspaper. And I should just like to point out it's fiction. Again, one reviewer said, how delightful that, Persaud had these fantastic sources to go to. And in fact, the name of the staff reporter is a combination of 2 friends and their dog. So, that's where that comes from. So I'm going to read the newspaper extract and then the first chapter, which is in Rosie's voice. The Trinidad Monitor, Port of Spain, Trinidad, British West Indies, February 23rd, August 1957. The End of Boysie, by Gerald Max Davidson, staff reporter. Knowing the end was coming, John Boysie Singh, the Raja, who once controlled illegal activities in Port of Spain and in the Gulf of Paria, said, I have lived, I have seen things and I have done things. Now I must go, but I am innocent of this crime. I always tried to help people, and that is how I got a great deal of my troubles. That is what has me here now. He asked to go first, but on 20th August 1957 was made to wait an hour until 8 o'clock after Bolan Ramkissoon's body was cut down and laid aside. A Catholic priest, Father Tiernan, who asked for his name not to be reported, walked him to the gallows. Wearing prison-issue white cotton pajamas, the Raja met death chanting, My Jesus mercy, my Jesus mercy, my Jesus mercy. As prescribed, the hangman was paid $77 per man for his duties. A Gregorio Brothers van took the body from the jail to the General Hospital and then to the St. James Cemetery, where Boysie was laid to rest in a crude white pine, unpainted coffin, his name written on top in chalk. None of his close relatives, seen visiting the condemned man in the days leading up to the hanging, were present at the graveside. Rosie. While the shop I'm busy, I told myself, Rosie girl, drink a cup of coffee, tea, and check the papers. Nobody's coming for a shot of rum this hour, and on the dry goods side is always one person throughout the day. I ain't sit down good when I spotted the wretch. Man dead and he's still making front page. And look at that. Boysie playing innocent down to the end. Exactly who that Bajon think he fooling? At least now he's in the ground, we might get an ease from seeing him all the time. Something else will take over the news. Every night the Lord seen me on my knees begging that boy doesn't fill the gap he's left. They say goat don't make sheep. Well, this is one time I hope they're wrong, yes? A sudden hard rain made me put down the papers. 2 school children, a girl about 7 and a boy child a little younger, rushed to shelter under the shop awning. The way she held on to the boy, I could tell she was a good big sister. I called to them. Come inside and don't get wet. You see how the sun's still shining? Rain go past now for now. They came and stood by the door. I smiled. Come in, I don't bite. The girl pulled her brother where they were safe from the pelting rain. You know what they say, that when sun shining and rain falling, monkey does be marrying. Either that or the devil and his wife fighting. Poor children looked at me like I was about to gobble them up. A good 5 minutes hadn't passed and rain stopped just so. The 2 bolted. I watched them speed off, holding hands tight. Steam rose from the hot pitch, releasing a sickly sweet smell that made me feel slightly nauseous. Then something happened. Maybe it was the pitch smell, or the little boy and girl holding hands, or just reading the death notice. Could be all 3. Suddenly, I realized what had been bothering my head. I was thinking of Boysie. What's that game children play, the one with 2 circles holding hands and singing in turns? Ah, yes. In a fine castle, do you hear my CCO? In a fine castle, do you hear my CCO? Without missing a beat, the second circle would reply. Ours is the prettiest, do you hear my CCO? Ours is the prettiest, do you hear my CCO? What song did we throw back? Ah, yes. We want one of them, do you hear my CCO? We want one of them, do you hear my CCO? From the side, under a laden guava tree, a boy, had to be less than 10, was watching us playing in the road. Our eyes made 4. Without words, he knew that we coolie orphans, holding hands while singing louder and louder, had room for other unclaimed children. Which of us do you want? Do you hear my CCO? I broke hands mid-song so he could join my circle. He came forward slowly and gave me his hand. That little hand squeezed mine just a bit tighter than the others. I squeezed back. Which of us do you want? Do you hear my CCO? A scared boy, out on the road by himself, nobody looking to see what he was doing. That barefoot, raggedy child grew into John Boysie Singh. How that happened? Thank you.
Well, yeah, wow. And most people here would know exactly who Boysie Singh was. He died in the early 60s. I was born in 1960, and it's very clear to me who he was. And he was not a nice man. And he was a very violent man, socio-psychopathic. I'm not a specialist. I can't pronounce with authority, but certainly not right in the head. Yet you're hearing at that very beginning, and I think it was beautifully read there, Ingrid, where you place him as a vulnerable child, and being taken into a circle, and yet we know that he is going to commit grave acts of violence, domestic as well as for financial gain and for retribution, if you like. Tell us a little bit about how people are violent in situations where they have actually received some form of love, are loved, or actually do love. What's your view on that?
On our ability to love? Gosh, I don't know if I'm any authority to talk about that, but the bit that I read for you is to give you a moment of reflection that perhaps we all carry burdens and we all learn to love depending on how we're loved, perhaps. And maybe sometimes in spite of how we're loved, we can overcome that. John Boysie Singh, however, knew how to love himself. And it is in the voices of the women who all loved him in particular ways. You see him unable to respond or simply taking. Because I didn't have a lot of source material to go to, there's this one book written by journalist Bickerton, which you may be familiar with. It's in print. That was a source book, and the records from his 3 murder trials were destroyed in the Red House fire. So I had to go to newspapers, songs that were written at the time. I see my friend Professor Ramchan in the audience, and I had to pick his brains to get research. But essentially, the women were just one-liners. So Popo, all you hear about in the Bickerton book is something like 2 sentences, and it says, he lived with Popo. She looked after his son Chunksy, his only child, and he tried to kill her. That's not a spoiler from a mass murderer, okay? He tried to kill her in a rather gruesome way. So from just that little bit, I have to extract a whole life of a woman because she's written out of history. That is all we know. So rather than talk about how Boysie might love, actually I was much more interested in these women that were in his life and how they loved and what they gave to it in spite of him.
That's very fascinating when we think that your previous novel is a well-known, much-loved poem by Derek Walker, which tells us that we have to remember how to love ourselves, and yet this is the exact opposite that's happening. Soraya, in terms of your book, and that gender-based violence is, throughout it. And even though we are looking at a supernatural incident where the real perpetrators are supernatural forces, the hints of violence and are palpable. The Batty Boy stuff Nigel looking at his much-loved older brother, who he didn't measure up to. He loves him, but is desperately ashamed of him and the fact that he's gay, and he will be desperately upset to lose him. So this is sort of pulling. What is your view on cases where there is violence in the home, but it's violence happening amongst people who love each other? It's not an act of hatred. It's an act of perhaps misplaced love. But what's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it can be both love and not love in a way. Like, I think of the quote that I really love by Toni Morrison in The Bluest Eye, where she says, wicked people love wickedly, violent people love violently, the love of a free man is never safe, there's no gift for the beloved. I might be missing a part, but that's basically the quote. And I think that quote to me speaks to some of what you were just saying, Ingrid, in terms of we are taught certain messages about how to love, whether we're worthy of love, and that can influence how we look for love and also how we show love. And so I think there is that. And at the same time, I feel like there also needs to be, a certain amount of accountability when we talk about that too. I think, yes, there can be love. And also, I think what can happen is a lot of entitlement over how you think a person should be showing you love, or how you think a person should be existing. And as a social worker, I've done a lot of work with survivors in abusive relationship, and I often would think about, do the abusive partners, are they doing these things intentionally? Are they just happening? And does it really matter? Because the consequence is the same either way, whether they intended it or not. But I also think, on the other hand, a lot of the survivors I would talk to often wouldn't necessarily want their partner to be in jail. They want the violence to stop. But they do remember a lot of the good parts of the relationship. And I think, I think that as a social worker, I believe that in healing, and that everyone has that capability. I think that it's very difficult. And I think that in addition to the trauma, especially when you're talking about men inflicting violence on women, it's so much of feeling possession over them, and so many other messages that get ingrained that aren't a part of love at all. Maybe you were taught that they were, but they're not.
Yeah, that notion of ownership, people owning other people. So which makes me ask the question, to what extent do you think these very unhealthy, unequal, personal, familial relations are reflecting a wider societal or cultural mores that we've inherited and continue to live in?
Wait, can you ask that again?
In other words, are we playing out in these instances where one partner may think they own the other partner? It's an ownership of a body. We come from a history of forced labor where people were owned and their freedom was bought by paying the people who owned them, not the people who were freed. To what extent is that notion of ownership over somebody else's body and your right, your entitlement, reflecting something inherited in our wider society?
I think I'll often come across studies that will talk about the disproportion of intimate partner violence in Black communities in the U.S. And I don't think that's about genetics or race, really. But what I do think about is that, yes, Black men are often emasculated, are often abused by systems, and I think oftentimes get equated to women, which is also considered a second class. You know what I mean? So I feel like it's kind of like Black women get both. You know, they get the racism, but then also Black men working out their racism on them, like that they're experiencing. And I think to bring it back to the book, I feel like, so when you get to the chapter that I read, you've mostly seen Nigel as an adult, and you see that he can be kind of a hard man towards his wife, Beatrice, and also towards his kids. And then this kind of gives you some insight into his childhood, where you see that his father really favored his brother. His father really emasculated him because he was into poetry. And at the same time, like, he uses that kind of like to try to one-up his brother, which ends up killing him. You know, I don't think he intended to kill him, but I think those fears about not being man enough ended up him sabotaging his brother because he was gay and he didn't know how to process that.
Yeah. So in the sort of wider societal context, Ingrid, I'm going to ask you the next question. Now, being born in 1968, which was 6 years after independence, I always thought that the problems that we live in today in Trinidad were very much about some notion of Britain shedding colonies after the humiliation of the Suez Crisis, and that we just didn't govern as well as we ought to. But when you read Bickerton's book, it's quite clear that corruption was well entrenched long before 1962. Corruption was well entrenched in our judiciary and police force under British rule. So to that extent, and it's important because it disabuses us of some sense of guilt that we may sometimes feel about how we are administering ourselves. To that extent, Ingrid, to what extent do you think that Boysie was a product of the environment that he was born into? In your novel, the fictitious creation. Yeah.
Absolutely. So one interpretation would be to say that Boysie was a product of his time and of poverty and being an Indian in town that isolated him from his community, etc. But, you know, I don't write like that. And I don't make those assumptions. And the reason I don't goes back to your comment. We don't own corruption. We don't own, piracy and mass murdering, etc. This has been happening from time immemorial. This is about the human condition. So we don't own it, and to write with the weight of political representation would be to create, very stick figure-y type characters rather than nuanced characters, people who are motivated by many things at many times, and so I in that sense it's not political.
Yeah. Yes. Which
I have a lot of family in the audience.
So this, I have time, I think, for one last question before we put something to the audience. And it's something you said, it is, Soraya, and this question is going to be to both of you, but I'm going to ask Ingrid first, and it's about this notion of accountability. We cannot be held accountable if we don't have power. We can't be held accountable for failure to do what we're supposed to be responsible for if we don't have power. And similarly, if we are not held accountable, we are effectively disempowered. So with that sense, Ingrid, what is your view as to holding Boysie accountable through the eyes of the women the lives that he has touched and left them longing, basically?
I don't really care if he's accountable or not. What I was interested in is to bring the lives of the women who were erased from history to the forefront. So Boysie might be the conduit on which a great story is told, but I'm much more interested in uncovering the lives of women who, I think were representing all of us women in this audience at some point in our lives, and therefore it's those voices that I'm concerned about. And if I feel accountable to anything, it is an accountability to do them justice.
To the unsung.
Yeah.
Beautiful. And Soraya, in terms of accountability, it was the word that you used earlier on.
For Nigel. Yeah, I mean, I think similar to what I hear Ingrid saying, like, I feel like talking about, like, I, in the world, I'm somebody that believes in, like, transformative justice and abolition and a lot of things. But in terms of, like, fiction, my goal, I think, was really just to try to tell it like it is, in a way, like, so the chapter that I read is the only chapter that really focuses on Nigel. Most of the book is from one of the daughter's points of view, and then there's also one about the mother. So the book is mostly about women, and then there's this kind of anomaly chapter about Nigel and his brother and his father. And the point wasn't really like that this was a redemption story. I don't know that it necessarily makes him look better or not. I think that Nigel is complicated, and I think it shows you more about him as a person. I think every person that we see as a villain will probably give you some reason for why they do what they do. I feel like people never think of themselves as the villain. You know what I mean? I think we think of them as the villain. And so I feel like it was important for me when writing about these characters that you're kind of seeing that, and readers make their own conclusions about the characters, what they represent. But yeah, I think most of the focus of the book is really more about how the daughters, which weren't in this chapter, but Sasha and Zora, how they're navigating the violence that they see as they're growing up, and how do they find love for themselves? How do they learn how to show love, despite all of the things that have happened to them?
Tremendous, absolutely tremendous. I think at this point I'd like to ask if there are any questions. Oh, time is up. My watch is obviously 5 minutes. So, sorry, no more questions? Okay. Oh, no. No? I had 5 minutes according to my...
Shall we just take an executive decision and have 2 questions, one to each of us?
If the organizers would allow that.
They can't. We're on the stage.
Yeah. I know. Could we just...
No?
Nope.
Okay.
Well, I thought that was a beautiful example of empowerment. I mean, it didn't go through to full fruition, but more power to you, Ingrid, next time. Thank you, everybody. Thanks. So, how do we get to the signing table? Oh, I didn't even get to wrap.